On a humid afternoon in 1966, Private James O'Neill was on patrol in the thick jungles of Vietnam's Binh Dinh province when he stumbled upon a tripwire carefully hidden amongst the shrubs. In less than a split second, the harrowing noise of a whip was followed by a sharp metal hook embedding itself deep in his calf. Unable to walk, his fellow comrades were forced to carry the young soldier, who was now in excruciating pain, back to safety. This was the harsh reality for thousands of American and South Vietnamese soldiers who ventured deep into the unforgiving territory of the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. For awaiting them in the jungle were sinister traps aimed at immobilizing troops, and one wrong step could have resulted in a deep gash, nasty infection, or even death. Join us in this video as we explore the disturbing and life-threatening traps that lurked in the shadows of the jungle during the Vietnam War. From the infamous bamboo whip to the highly lethal punji stake pit, these are the devious and downright disturbing things tunnel rats did to U.S. soldiers in the Vietnam War. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the U.S. military, alongside South Vietnamese forces, was actively engaged in a brutal war against the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla group. The latter became infamous for their highly effective and terrifying strategies aimed at countering the resources and firepower of the U.S. forces. The Viet Cong knew the terrain better than anyone and could easily blend in with the local population, using the element of surprise to their advantage throughout the war. They also established an expansive network of underground tunnels that allowed them to stealthily transverse the village while being undetected by their enemies. But the most brutal tactic of all was their extensive use of booby traps. These sinister methods of war were employed to level the playing field by striking fear into the hearts of the U.S.-South Vietnamese alliance. Most of the ingenious devices were simple materials but had the capacity to demoralize, injure, and even kill the soldiers. General Vo Nguyen Dap, a Vietnamese general, communist revolutionary, and politician who's widely regarded as one of the greatest military strategists of the 20th century, emphasized the importance of the traps in their war efforts, stating, "We will fight the enemy with our cunning and make them die in their anger," highlighting the guerrilla army's determination to use what they can to overcome the odds. During the entirety of the Vietnam War, the guerrilla army employed the use of numerous distinct and equally terrifying traps. In the next part of this video, we will discuss 5 of the most heinous and frightening booby traps set up by the communist forces during the conflict. Number 1. The punji stick trap. None of the traps send chills down the spine quite like this simple contraption consisting of sharpened bamboo sticks that were strategically placed in the ground, hidden from sight of U.S. soldiers until it was too late. They were designed to cause an immense amount of pain by impaling the unsuspecting soldiers as they ventured through the jungle. The Viet Cong forces generally placed such traps in areas that U.S. forces might travel through, including narrow jungle trails or close to riverbanks. Punji sticks were placed pointing upright at the bottom of a hole before being covered with material that would camouflage them. When a U.S. soldier broke through the flimsy cover over the hole, they would step on the spikes at the bottom and suffer injuries to their feet and legs. While this already sounds gruesome, there were several ways to make this trap even more deadly. The first involved installing the stakes at a downward angle along the sides of the hole. This would make it increasingly more difficult for the victim to remove themselves from the hole without causing further damage. The second method sees the guerrilla forces dig an adjacent hole, allowing them to trap a second soldier with little effort. When a U.S. or South Vietnamese soldier became impaled in one trap, a comrade would rush to their aid, only to fall into the second hole and become trapped as well. To enhance the effectiveness of the trap, the bamboo stakes were covered in urine or feces, which aimed to increase the chance of infection in soldiers. Sometimes, they were even coated with poisonous substances sourced from the native animals and plants of the jungles. These effective traps showcase the simplicity of the weapons utilized by the Viet Cong. They would take little preparation, yet the effects on the mortality of opposing forces were potent, with many experiencing an increased level of anxiety as they patrolled the dense jungles. As the U.S.-Vietnamese alliance became increasingly aware of these booby traps, they began implementing methods to combat the bamboo stakes. One measure was the implementation of boots with reinforced soles, which protected the soldiers against puncture wounds. Another saw scouts venture ahead of the patrol to probe the ground for any signs of hidden traps. However, in response, the Viet Cong began to construct even more sophisticated punji stick traps, some of which featured springed or hinged mechanisms that could snap shut on the limbs of soldiers. Ultimately, these traps remained a severe threat to U.S. soldiers throughout the entirety of the war. Number 2. Hidden landmines and grenade cans. As the war waged on in Vietnam, the U.S. and Vietnamese soldiers quickly became aware that traps, far more destructive than the sharp end of a bamboo stake, lay hidden beneath the shallow pathways of the jungle. Landmines were strategically placed throughout the war zone, and this showcases the Viet Cong's mastery of psychological warfare as they continued to prey on the U.S. soldiers from the shadows. The infamous German S-mine, also known as the Bouncing Betty, was one such device. This small propellant charge launched the mine 3 to 5 feet into the air, and less than a second later, the main charge detonated, releasing shrapnel in all directions. The shrapnel was made up of steel balls, rods, or scrap metal. Anyone in the immediate vicinity of such an explosion could face severe injuries and, in many cases, death. According to the Paralyzed Veterans of America, these deadly explosives accounted for over 64,000 deaths during the Vietnam War. An equally terrifying and destructive device employed by the guerrilla forces was the grenade in a can. This design, again, highlights the simplistic nature of many of the booby traps utilized by the Viet Cong during the war. As the name implies, this device was constructed by placing a live grenade with its pin removed within a can, which was held down by the striker lever. Following this, a tripwire was then attached, and when set off, it would pull the grenade from the can, causing it to explode. This caused an unprecedented amount of physical harm to anyone standing in the immediate vicinity of the blast. This particular form of booby trap was generally positioned along the entrances to the Viet Cong's tunnels. Number 3. Venomous snake traps. In their efforts to level the playing field, the Viet Cong employed the use of venomous snakes in their booby traps and even went as far as to poison the food and water supplies of the U.S. Vietnamese forces. One particularly heinous booby trap saw the guerrilla soldiers were the creation of snake pits, primarily utilized within the dark and humid tunnel systems. Here, highly poisonous snakes were attached to a stick of bamboo, which, when released, would be at a prime height to inflict maximum damage on an individual. Venomous snakes and even scorpions were also placed in hidden compartments in the tunnels, which unsuspecting U.S. soldiers would stumble upon and receive an incapacitating and excruciating bite or sting. The Viet Cong were particularly fond of using bamboo pit vipers. This species of snake inflicted a severe bite, and within minutes, the flesh turned swollen, necrotic, and became extremely painful. However, this paled in comparison to the Malayan crate, often nicknamed the two-step snake. This highly venomous serpent's name is rooted in a myth that an individual will take as little as 2 steps before they drop dead following a bite from this hazardous creature. The use of such animals throughout the war added an additional level of anxiety to the already stressed and fearful soldiers. Number 4. Bamboo whip and wire traps. Among the various tactics employed by the guerrilla soldiers during the height of the Vietnam War, wire traps remain the most notorious for their silent but deadly nature. The deadly booby traps led to thousands of casualties during the war, and many are as insidious as those portrayed in even the darkest of horror movies. Such devices emphasize the expertise of the Viet Cong in utilizing native materials to cause maximum harm, but it also showcases their knowledge of the jungle terrain, which they used to create a terror-ridden experience for many soldiers. One particularly ruthless example was snap traps, often referred to as whips. These traps were generally composed of a long bamboo pole attached by a tripwire and pulled back to create a significant amount of tension. At the top of the bamboo stick, numerous sharp and spiked bamboo points would be attached. When the trap was set off, this device flung towards the unsuspecting soldiers with considerable force, often impaling their lower limbs. To inflict even further damage upon their enemies, the Viet Cong often laced the bamboo spikes with a plethora of poisonous materials, hoping to incapacitate the US and South Vietnamese soldiers further. Number 5. Swinging mace. Quite possibly the most feared trap of all was that of the mace. While such a device may seem inspired by an Indiana Jones movie, for the US and South Vietnamese soldiers, it was a deadly trap that could deal an unprecedented amount of pain and suffering to them and their comrades. The swinging mace operated in a manner similar to the bamboo whip, but instead of a stick, the sharp stakes were attached to a large ball made from wood, metal, or clay. The ball could be as large as 24 inches in diameter and weigh up to 40 pounds, which is more than enough to produce a deadly force. Like many other booby traps, they were set up using a tripwire. When an unsuspecting soldier tripped the wire, the ball was released from its secluded position amongst the trees and hastily flew towards the upper body and head of a victim. If it connected with an individual, there was an unfortunate chance of being badly impaled and wounded. The unlucky souls sometimes suffered such a significant amount of damage to their bodies that death soon fell upon them. Looking back at the insidious and foul traps utilized by the Viet Cong throughout the war, it's easy to see that many were incapable of killing US and South Vietnamese soldiers outright. But these crude devices had long-lasting physiological effects on the men who were confined to life in a foreign jungle. Soldiers were in a constant state of fear, worried about each and every step they took in the jungle, for one wrong move could result in a horrifying injury or even death. Those who suffered the fate of a swinging mace or whip trap were undoubtedly left with nasty gashes and life-threatening infections. However, the decrease in morale these booby traps brought with them was ingenious and played a significant role in the success of the Viet Cong throughout the conflict.